Anselm, Arlen, Benedict.
What did he say?
Did he just say the names?
Hands force Anselm's wrists outward as iron bands bite into splintered wood. The crowd chants the victim's crime in short bursts while torches throw hard light across faces. The narrator identifies the chapter's emotion root as fear and frames the scene in precise terms. Fear that spectacle will erase bodies and fear that law will claim spectacle as necessity. The central problem stands visible within the first moments, an execution designed not only to kill but to obliterate identity and teach obedience through visible ruin. The narrator moves back from the wheel and records actions like a clerk copying a ledger. He notes the magistrate's seal on the indictment, the iron bands hammered to fit the rim, the way the wheelwright lines notches where a bone will catch. The narrator does not speak in metaphors. He catalogues, he names actors, he traces motive through orders and payments. The first concrete conflict appears when Anselm, strapped and sweating, manages to shift his weight and coughs out a name that arrests the wheelwright's attention. Anselm. Tell them about the altered rims. The wheelwright, I do my duty. Town magistrate. Keep him quiet. The line exchange is short and sharp. The magistrate barks at the wheelwright and the wheelwright answers in blunt, measured phrases. That exchange pulls authority into the light and makes clear the stakes. The narrator watches the wheelwright's hands. The wheelwright tests a band with the flat of his hammer. He says that some wheels are fitted to last longer, for ceremony, not mercy. The narrator marks that statement and notes the ledger entry that authorizes additional payments for extended display. The opening returns quickly to context without losing momentum. The narrator describes the legal origin of the sentence by showing the indictment that sits on the magistrate's bench. The document bears the magistrate's mark and a list of witnesses. The magistrate taps the parchment and explains, in a tone that treats cruelty as accounting, why the wheel must be public. The narrator records the magistrate's words with the same steadiness used to record the wheel's circumference. Town magistrate. Public punishment keeps order. Town magistrate. We set examples. Those lines are brief. They are followed by the wheelwright's practical retort. The wheelwright speaks about timber, iron, and the angle of the hammer blow. He names tools by function rather than by sentiment. The narrator notes the shift from legal argument to craft. The chapter's first emotion shift moves from structured civic justification to a rising current of dread in bystanders as the wheel is altered to extend suffering. Outside the courthouse, in the wheelwright's yard, an external event halts the routine. A child in the crowd points and shouts that the chronicler drew a different map than the magistrate's copy. The magistrate's face tightens. He sends 2 men to fetch the chronicler. This arrival forces a confrontation and introduces the second-named secondary character with power. The chronicler, a clerk who keeps parallel records. The chronicler appears smelling of ink and soot. He carries a different account and a stack of receipts that contradict the magistrate's tally. Chronicler, your receipts do not match, magistrate. Town magistrate, stay where you are. Chronicler, the wheel was charged as standard, then upgraded off the books. The chronicler's accusation is short and changes how the audience perceives the earlier exchange. The narrator notes the sudden spike in tension. The magistrate's men step forward. The wheelwright does not intervene. He keeps his hands on the hammer. This is a concrete reveal. Payments were redirected to increase spectacle. The plot twist reframes the wheel as a civic tool corrupted by profit. In the yard, the wheelwright continues his visible work. He fits iron bands to the spokes and punches deliberate gouges where limbs will rest. The narrator records exact measurements and the order of operations. He watches Anselm try to steady his breath and see that Anselm's chest rises and falls in measured gasps. Anselm speaks in short fragments, naming other men who were altered for the show. Anselm. They widened the rim for a month. Anselm. They left a notch to keep a foot from slipping. Those lines add detail to the earlier accusation. The narrator notes the faces in the crowd as evidence. Some are curious, some stare as if learning a lesson, others look away. This movement in the crowd marks another emotion shift. Curiosity hardening into revulsion for some, and for others a cold acceptance. The narrator notes these reactions not as commentary, but as data that explains how the spectacle changed the town's will. The magistrate interrupts a test strike. He steps into the yard and addresses the wheelwright light loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear. The magistrate asserts order and threatens to punish anyone who undermines the public record. The chronicler challenges him again. The back and forth escalates into an argument where 3 to 5 fast exchanges mark the conflict. The narrator keeps his voice distant but records every line. Town magistrate, quiet, the record stands. Chronicler, the account differs by 2 coins by nails and extra iron. Town magistrate, you accuse me of theft. Chronicler, I accuse the practice. Town magistrate, then you will be charged for slander. The argument forces other actors to choose. The wheelwright looks at the magistrate, and then at the chronicler. He places his hammer down for a moment. When he speaks, his voice is low, precise. The wheelwright, I took instructions. I made the wheel as ordered. The wheelwright, I will not judge why orders come. His lines are few, they make his role explicit. Procedural craft that accepts orders without moral framing. The narrator records the exchange, then returns attention to Anselm strapped near the wheel. Anselm presses his forehead to cold stone and hums an old prayer in a voice that shakes. Anselm, I saw men arrive with new bands. They measured faces rather than crimes. Anselm, they me this was for the good of the town. The narrator places those statements next to the magistrate's ledger entries and notes discrepancies. Every 3 to 5 paragraphs a new event appears. The chronicler's accusation, the magistrate's threat, the wheelwright's measured confession. Those events propel the plot through evidence and confrontation. Night falls and torches are set. The wheel moves to the scaffold under the magistrate's direction. Officials take positions. The crowd shifts from talking to holding breath. The narrator notes concrete sensory details that influence decisions. The way the iron smells when struck, the sharp ring of hammer on band, the taste of dust in mouths. He avoids vague mood descriptions and reports visible physical reactions. The execution begins properly when the wheelwright positions Anselm's limb and raises the hammer. His first strike is a testing blow. The crowd is silent for a measured moment, and then murmurs rise like the tide. The narrator times the sequence and records the hammer blows as units of procedure. He notes that the wheelwright follows a pattern meant to break, and then display. The scene functions as the chapter's climax beat and the emotional and visual peak. Blow 1 lands, flesh bruises, bone cracks. The narrator lists exact actions. The wheelwright sets an iron wedge. A helper tightens the leather strap. The magistrate counts aloud. The crowd's response thins from chant to stunned silence. Anselm cries out in a guttural sound that cuts the air. This is an active, concrete moment of pain and public reaction. The narrator does not embellish sensations with poetic language. He notes the pitch of the cry and the sudden folding of a woman's shoulders in the crowd. Anselm. It hurts. Town magistrate, remember why we do this. The wheelwright. 1 more strike. Each line is short and functional. The magistrate's reminder tries to reclaim the moment as civic lesson. The wheelwright's response is ritual work. Anselm's voice fractures, and with each strike the crowd's mood changes. Some lean closer, some step back. A child near the front begins to whimper. The narrator writes that the child's whimper is a data point. Future compliance taught by plastic memory. Mid-chapter, the narrator introduces a mini-cliffhanger that rearranges culpability. A helper on the scaffold drops a piece of parchment. It flutters against Anselm's boot. The narrator retrieves it and reads an order from the town council instructing that the next execution be lengthened for effect and signed by a name previously believed to be opposed to spectacle. The reveal changes how the narrator and the audience understand who authorized the corruption. It is a concrete discovery that forces the magistrate to flinch. Town magistrate. Where did that come from? Chronicler. From your hand, perhaps. Town magistrate. Lies. The accusation creates a short, sharp argument with 3 to 5 fast replies. The magistrate demands the parchment be returned and the chronicler be silent. The narrator records the moment with exactitude. He notes the helper's blinking, the wheelwright's tightened jaw, and Anselm's sudden stillness as he hears the counsel's name. The helper's dropping of the parchment is an external event that leads directly into the climax. The final sequence of blows follows after this reveal. The wheelwright resumes with procedural calm. He names parts of the body he targets. The narrator follows each phrase and logs who moves, who watches, and who reaches for a torch. After the final hammer strike, the crowd dissolves into noise. The magistrate calls for the body to be taken to the cart for display at the town gate. The chronicler argues for burial, but the magistrate insists on the show. Another confrontation breaks out. Voices overlap in short lines. Chronicler, bury him. Town magistrate, display him. Chronicler, this is wrong. Town magistrate, the law stands. The wheelwright begins to clean his tools. He wipes blood with a piece of cloth and places it in a leather bag. He counts the nails and the bands out loud like inventory. His actions convert what others see as violence into the mechanics of his profession. The narrator records the counting and the inventory as evidence of how bureaucracy absorbs horror. In the aftermath, the narrator follows the magistrate and the chronicler to a small chamber where records sit open on a table. He watches the magistrate circle entries and mark payments with a thin metal stylus. The chronicler points to the line that authorized an extended display fee. The magistrate looks up and snaps. The chronicler lowers his voice and names the counsel who signed in absentia. The narrator records the name and notes where to find witnesses. Anselm is put on the cart in a half-conscious state. He reaches a trembling hand toward the wheel as broken spoke and clutches it briefly, his fingers close around splintered wood. The narrator notes the pressure in those fingers and the way Anselm's eyes fix on the broken spoke. The action is concrete and ends the chapter's emotional thread with a situational beat. The final paragraph ties to a specific event. Before the cart moves, the narrator kneels and lifts the broken spoke from earth. He holds it by its jagged end, shows it to the chronicler and the magistrate, and says, in a voice that registers like a record entry, that the spoke will be logged and copies of the magistrate's ledger will be placed in the town archive. The magistrate replies with a pale face and a single line, "Town magistrate, do what you will." The narrator places the spoke in his satchel and orders a clerk to make a copy of the council's payment entries. The chapter closes on that ordered action. The taking of the ledger copy and the small, deliberate movement of the cart as it starts toward the gate. The conflict in this chapter, the deliberate alteration of punishment for spectacle, is resolved locally. Evidence has been identified, a ledger copied, and the chronicler's accusation recorded. The narrator ends on a concrete beat, not on reflection. The wheel is broken, the spoke is removed, and the ledger moves into the archives as a matter for subsequent chapters. A hammer struck the rim and a pale splinter spat blood. Anselm's wrists flexed against the rope and his breath came in tight pulls. Fear lived in the way his fingers clenched the wood, and that fear drove him to speak names he had held silent until then. The wheelwright paused with the hammer raised. "Name them now," the bailiff, voice flat. The narrator recorded the motion of the hand, the tilt of the lamp, and the fact that the decision before them was technical and moral in equal measure. The yard smelled of iron filings and wet leather. The town's wheelwright worked under a single lantern tied to a post. Tools lay in ordered rows on a scarred bench. Anselm stood bound beside the wheel, his tunic torn, a fresh bruise darkening his temple. The narrator noted facts. The wheel had been sawn from old oak, the spokes steam, bent iron bands hammered to fit tighter than in ordinary punishments. The immediate problem in the yard was concrete. This wheel was being altered to ensure more than a quick death. The wheelwright, called by name in the records, measured a spoke against Anselm's forearm and muttered specifications. He kept his fingers away from the man's skin, treating the body as a component. The bailiff held the rope looped once about his wrist, never releasing pressure. The town scribe unrolled the parchment on a low stone table and read aloud the sentence and the terms. That reading turned a custom into an order. Town scribe, the wheelwright, speak the measurements again. His voice was gravelly, practical. The scribe tapped the wax seal with a nail and read numbers. 2 strikes to the upper limb, 3 to the lower, 30 minutes of display at the hill. Governor's stamp, the scribe added. The wheelwright did not look at Anselm as he spoke those numbers. He looked at the list. Anselm forced his chin upward. He was thin, hooked into the rope, but his eyes were open and specific. It was Martin. He managed, Martin of the East Gate. He struck my brother. He testified twice. His words arrived in short fragments, each one a small exertion. That naming changed the yard's geometry. Faces tightened, and a new tension rose. The narrator marked the shift, fear collecting into action. The bailiff stepped forward and touched the waxed parchment. Martin stands by his witness, he said. The counsel agreed. He flicked his gaze to the wheelwright. We will follow the seal. The wheelwright nodded and began to fit an iron band closer, hammer strikes ringing sharp in the night. The sound cut the yard into active pieces, measure, read, name, strike. For a moment Anselm's voice steadied and he spoke more. A Benedict watched. He laughed when they pulled my sister from the house. His halting sentences carried concrete claims. He pointed with his chin toward the town gate where torches guttered. That act forced the wheelwright to look at a human cause and effect instead of a list of dimensions. The wheelwright tightened a clamp and adjusted a wedge. He tested the fit by striking with a small mallet. A faint crack came from the wood and a splinter slid free. The wheelwright then tapped the bone next to Anselm's wrist and watched for a flinch. An exchange followed between the bailiff and the wheelwright that lasted short and precise. Will it break on the first strike? The bailiff, if we temper the band less, it will give more. The wheelwright replied, but the governor wanted obliteration of name as well as limb. Then temper it hard. The bailiff, make it last. The wheelwright's hammer moved again. A new figure appeared at the lean-to shadowed edge. A messenger the bailiff had sent earlier. He carried a sealed packet stamped with the governor's ring. An addendum arrived this hour, the messenger said, breath clouding in the cold. He set the packet on the table and slid the seal so the scribe could open it. The narrator wrote the exact time recorded in the town log. The seal's impression showed the governor's personal device. Everyone in the yard knew that seal meant not local custom, but explicit intent. The scribe broke the wax and read the addendum aloud in a voice that lowered the room's temperature further. By decree of the governor, he said, the breaking pattern is amended. The condemned shall be displayed longer, and the breaks shall be conducted to remove identifying marks. The crown requires the erasure of name as public example. The scribe's pen hovered above the parchment, as if to mark the moment. Anselm tilted his head and stared at the lines. His fingers dug into the rope for a fraction of a second. The narrator recorded the reaction as evidence of an emotional shift, fear bending into a brittle clarity. The wheelwright looked at the sentence and then at Anselm. For the first time in the night he spoke directly to the man. You understand why I do this? He said. His words were not pity. They were a practical justification. I make the instrument. I do not decide the measure. Anselm's reply was a small laugh that sounded like a cough. You make bones fall apart. He said, you call it craft. I call it theft. The wheelwright's face did not change. He set a metal wedge into the spoke and struck once. Arguments unfolded in the yard in short bursts. The bailiff insisted on following orders. "We answer to law," he said. "We are not here to debate the governor's will." The scribe added, "The record must be kept clean. If the record reads mercy, the governor will ask why." The wheelwright countered in a flat tone. "If I weaken the band, he dies quick. If I harden it, the town remembers the punishment longer." Each line was a choice about consequence. The narrator recorded the exchange without editorializing, but with attention to who shifted the plan. Anselm tried to argue with names as armor. "Benedict me to keep quiet," he said. "He let the law choose. Then we remain safe." "Benedict denies it," the bailiff answered. "He provided witness in court." The rapid back and forth produced small reveals. Benedict had reasons to stay silent then, and now he served as witness. The scribe wrote while his lips moved, copying numbers and names as if the act of writing could fix guilt. The wheelwright tested another spoke, listening for the difference when iron bit wood differently. At the workbench, the wheelwright prepared iron bands with a tempering fire. He pulled a band red, then thickened it with hammering until it rang lower. He dipped it into oil and the air hissed. The hiss made the bailiff look away for a beat. The sound carried a practical terror. Anselm watched the bands with a strange detachment, his breathing measured, his jaw set. That shift registered as defiance in concrete behavior. He stopped trying to pull at the rope and instead watched the tools as if taking them into account. The scribe produced another page with specifications. A pattern of strikes by limb, the placement to avoid immediate decapitation, instructions for positioning the wheel for public view. "Read the governor's words," he said. He read them precisely. The punishment must be prolonged to act as a civic lesson. The narrator recorded that phrasing verbatim in the ledger. The wheelwright pursed his lips and then asked, "Who oversees the strikes?" The bailiff, with 2 town servants present, the scribe answered, and a clerk to record each break. The arrangement moved legal responsibility off the wheelwright and onto the town's officials. Anselm spoke again, each sentence smaller than the last, but less fearful in content. "Martin lied in the square," he said. "He sought the reward for a testimony. He promised to take our land." He dragged his chin toward the gate. The wheelwright hesitated and then tapped the corner of a spoke with the hammer. "Names or not, the wheel does what it's built to do," he said. "That is my task." The wheelwright's manner remained methodical. His hands were steady. The narrator noted the contrast between human pleading and mechanical certainty. A sudden pull at the rope made Anselm lurch forward. A guard tightened a knot because Anselm had tried to spit at the scribe. "Don't waste saliva." The bailiff, "You will hold what you have and stop moving." Anselm's jaw worked. His eyes tracked each man who entered and left the lantern's circle. The narrator wrote, Anselm's attempts to speak had moved from naming to control of small bodily acts. That movement marked another emotional change, clarity hardening into resignation, actions narrowed to what he could still manage. Later the wheelwright positioned the wheel upright in the yard's center. He motioned for the bailiff to place Anselm beside it in the tether. "Stand steady," the wheelwright instructed as he readied the straps. The straps bit into cloth and skin. The wheelwright placed a wedge where a limb must rest, aligning wood with human anatomy. He tested by cracking a small bone from an animal leg he kept for practice. The crack sounded dull and precise. The wheelwright then mimicked the strike with quiet violence. Bone in training broke the way he anticipated. The bailiff watched and nodded. The narrator moved from passive note to precise cataloging. The wheelwright altered spokes to add iron studs that would increase shear. He notched pads to hold flesh closer to the rim. He shaved away a sap. Wood seam so bands would cut into bone under force. Each modification served a legal sentence that had shifted from death to erasure. The narrator wrote the names attached to this decision and the time the addendum had arrived. That list included the governor, the bailiff, and the town scribe. The wheelwright's hands left brass marks on the iron as he turned bolts. When the wheelwright delivered a full test strike to the prepared animal limb, the sound in the yard made even the scribe flinch. A single blow snapped the bone and splinters scattered. The wheelwright's glove caught small flakes of marrow. Anselm's face changed then. He made no sound, but he closed his eyes and the muscles in his neck jumped. The narrator recorded the moment as the chapter's peak. The choice to convert punishment into obliteration had been tested and proven in practice. That was the yard's climax. The wheelwright then stepped back and addressed the bailiff with a few flat words. "It breaks as ordered. It will remove a man's identifying parts if you follow the pattern," the bailiff replied. "We follow the governor's addendum." "Prepare the procession." The scribe bent to copy the final adjustment into the ledger. Anselm swallowed and tried to speak. He named Benedict again and then was cut off by a guard's gloved hand. A messenger was sent to the hill. The bailiff sealed orders in a pouch and gave it to a mounted rider with the town's crest. The wheelwright and 2 apprentices hauled the wheel toward the gate under lantern light. Their shoulders showed strain and the iron gleamed with oil. The narrator catalogued each actor's motion and their affiliation to the sentence. The wheelwright tied the last strap, measured the wheel's center, and marked the place where a human limb would rest. The chapter closed with a tactical movement rather than an abstraction. The scribe rolled up his record and placed a small note within the packet. The names Anselm had given, the timing of the test strike, and a marginal note. Governor instructed obliteration. The bailiff took the note and handed the pouch to the rider. The rider mounted, tightened his cloak, and left through the town gate with the wheel half assembled behind him. The narrator recorded the exact direction and the time the rider left. The final line of this evening's ledger reads, "Wheel half assembled, addendum delivered." Procession scheduled at dawn. That is where this chapter ends, on the road away from the yard and the sound of the rider's hooves moving toward the execution hill. Throughout the yard, the human responses tracked small, concrete behaviors. Anselm's fear altered his speech into accusation. Naming men became a defensive mechanism. The wheelwright's procedural detachment hardened into a decision when the addendum arrived. He translated policy into metal. The bailiff moved from legal recitation to active enforcement, and the scribe turned human statements into inked proof. Each movement changed the practical stakes. Who would wield agency at the hill, and whether the town would record obliteration as an acceptable civic lesson. There was a twist that altered the plan. The governor's addendum changed local custom into direct policy. It moved responsibility up the chain and removed options for local mercy. That revelation forced the wheelwright into a technical compliance he might have avoided absent the seal. It forced the bailiff to choose public spectacle over a quieter execution. It forced Anselm to recognize that naming accusers might not save him. It might only mark others for future retribution. One detail the narrator preserved that night was the wheelwright's private pause before the final strike. He held the hammer at shoulder height and looked at Anselm's face under the lantern light. For a fraction of a second his jaw moved as if saying words aloud and lowering them again. He then struck. The narrator documented the motion as evidence of deliberation. It was a human pause within an officially mandated machine. That moment showed that even procedural acts include personal choices. The yard emptied in ordered steps. The apprentices wiped tools with rags and replaced wedges. The scribe sealed his pages, and the bailiff counted the knots on the rope before leaving. Anselm was left tied to the wheel on the cart, the rope making white impressions on his wrists. He kept his head straight and watched the gate. His breathing slowed to a steady cadence, not because he was calmer, but because he had resigned himself to preserving the small control left. His attention. Anselm's last words in the yard were not a plea. He turned his head toward the wheelwright and said, "Remember the name Martin." The wheelwright only glanced and adjusted the iron band. The bailiff then ordered the cart readied and the men pulled the wheel toward the gate. The narrator closed the entry with a precise situational beat. A rider took the sealed addendum toward the hill, and the cart bearing the wheel moved after him. The record ends with a timestamp and a line noting the assembly of the public instruments. The chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The wheel has been calibrated to carry the governor's intent, the names have been recorded, and the procession is scheduled. The next chapter will follow that procession, but this account stops not in reflection, but at the precise moment the town converts private cruelty into public ceremony. The rider's cloak vanished through the gate, and the cart's wheels beat the rough road toward the hill. Dusk fell while the wheel sat half, mounted and hands tightened straps around the condemned. The wheelwright raised his hammer, and an assistant steadied the rope. Fear drove Anselm to speak before the first strike. The narrator records the emotion route as fear and frames it as the engine of choice. Anselm will trade names to slow the blows to buy breath. The sheriff calls for order. The crowd's chant presses like a physical thing against the platform. The narrator places the action. The execution hill outside the town, the wheel set on a low wooden cradle, torches guttering in wind that smelled of rain and wet straw. Anselm is strapped to the spokes, wrists burnt by rope and wrists raw where earlier bindings cut. His tunic is torn along the shoulder. The wheelwright stands with a leather apron dark at the seam, an iron hammer balanced in both hands. Sheriff Halvin checks the bailiff's parchment. The problem is clear within seconds. Anselm will be forced to supply names while the magistrates use the spectacle to settle accounts. Anselm's first change of feeling comes in the form of bargaining. He breathes and tries to trade one mercy for one name. He says, "Kellen took silver from the chest." He signed the receipts. Sheriff Halvin answers, "Name them plainly, Anselm." Anselm's voice phrase, and the narrator notes the shift from fear into calculation, fear bending into bargaining. The crowd leans forward as if to catch syllables that will free some or condemn others. The bailiff reads the formal sentence aloud while the wheelwright taps the rim with the hammer, testing the metal. By decree, the bailiff says, "This man shall suffer the breaking for his crimes." Magistrate Kellen stands near the crowd, face taut. Anselm says a name and the sheriff nods once, short. The narrator describes each exchange without moralizing. The scene is a ledger. Actions recorded, names tallied, consequences imminent. A magistrate's voice cuts through the chant as Magistrate Kellen stands and demands to be heard. "That is slander," he says. "My hands are clean." The crowd answers with a hiss. Brother Rohold approaches with a small pile of papers, folded inside a leather satchel. The first external event since the mounting. A man in a brown habit steps forward and holds out a ledger. He does not shout. He sets the book on a crate where anyone may see it. The ledger's edges are dark with thumb stains and a folded note peeks out. Brother Rohold speaks plainly. "There are receipts. They bear your mark, Kellen." The narrator notes the second emotion shift. Suspicion rising into confrontation among those with power. Magistrate Kellen's face reddens. "This is false," he says. "Who brought you these?" Brother Rohold lifts the corner of a page. His fingers do not tremble. The sheriff steps closer to the platform, hands resting on his belt. The wheelwright lowers his hammer a degree, counting the delay as an opportunity to examine a broken spoke. Marcel, the wheelwright's assistant, kneels and taps the edge of the wheel near the hub. "A splinter," he says, and the word travels up through the assembled bodies. The narrator records this immediate new fact, a structural flaw in the instrument of death. The wheelwright inspects the spoke with gauntleted hands. He turns the spoke under torchlight and finds a hairline crack. He looks at the hammer and then at the sheriff. The crowd quiets. Even the torches seem to hold their smoke. Kellen uses the moment to assert authority and to change the terms. He steps onto the crate and calls the guards forward. Delay is for the guilty to make themselves useful. He shouts, "Tie him tighter. Name the others or we finish now." Guards move like a single organism. Their ropes tighten at Anselm's wrists until the knots bite. The narrator notes the third emotion shift. Bargaining curdles into coercion, and coercion into anger directed both at the condemned and anyone who might challenge the magistrate. Anselm's throat works. He breathes short and says, "Brother Rohold, he kept account for the confessions at the abbey. He wrote down names. I can say where they hid the ledgers. He names a place instead of naming a person." A woman in the crowd cries out a name, and then another voice corrects her. The crowd begins to factionalize. Some shout for mercy. Others shout that any man who protects corrupt men must also burn. Dialogue multiplies as accusations and defenses stack on each other. Magistrate Kellen throws his hands up. "Enough," he says, "or I will clear this square." The sheriff answers, "You will not turn this into a market." Kellen. The two men trade short lines. The narrator keeps cadence, quick repartee, short sentences, back and forth. The crowd's mood cleaves. A group near the rear whispers that a ledger would ruin auctions and confiscations. Another group, poorer and nearer the platform, throws stones that strike the wooden scaffold. The stone event is external and immediate. The wheelwright flinches though his face remains closed. Brother Rohold shakes his head. "I brought it because I could not sign away the truth," he says. "I could not place the book with one hand and the cross on another and call it clean." His words are a kind of confession. Magistrate Kellen's fingers curl on the crate. "You besmirch the court." He snaps, "You besmirch us and buy favor with the mob." A cluster of guards responds by pressing the crowd back with the butt of a spear. The narrator marks the rising stakes. Now the execution serves as a stage for power to be asserted beyond the condemned body. A second physical discovery follows. A small folded note in the ledger shows a seal matching the magistrate's ring. Marcel whispers to the wheelwright, "It bears his mark," he says. "It bears a stamp." The wheelwright's hammer lowers further. Sheriff Halvin studies the note, then looks down at Anselm. The sheriff asks, "Did Kellen profit from confiscations?" Anselm answers in low, clipped breaths, "Yes. He signed where the goods went. He took share after sale." The crowd's murmur swells into a vocal tide. At the wheel platform, the wheelwright knows that time is a weapon as well as the hammer. He raps the rim again, louder, and this time the spoke cracks open with a splinter that flies into the air and thuds among the crowd. The narrator notes the mini cliffhanger. The wheel will fail if used. The crowd waits to see if the magistrate will punish failure with more cruelty. Magistrate Kellen's face closes. He barks, "Do not let one broken spoke stop justice." The sheriff looks at the wheelwright and then at the crowd. The choice lands squarely on the wheelwright's shoulders. The wheelwright takes 3 steps forward and addresses the sheriff. "It must be replaced or braced," he says. "It is unsafe for the procedure as ordered." Sheriff Halvin's thumb rubs the parchment edge. "We have no time," he says. "The market closes with the execution." "We cannot postpone," the wheelwright replies in a short, flat line. "I will make it hold." The narrator records the wheelwright's voice as methodical and insulated. A man who frames brutality as duty. While assistants scramble to fetch tools, Anselm tries to force breath through his mouth and speak another name. Kellen took. He starts, then coughs blood into his palm. The narrator shows the physical cost of speech. Each name draws blood and deeper bindings. The crowd's urgency turns to a sore hunger.
Someone shouts, "Finish him!"
Another voice answers, "Hold him. Make him speak." The wheelwright's hammer waits at his hip. The mood tightens like a drawn bow. A guard, seeing the ledger, steps away from the platform and intercepts Brother Rohold. "You cannot parade documents here," the guard says. Brother Rohold folds his habit tighter and pushes the book toward the sheriff. "I present it so the truth may be recorded," he replies. The guard tries to take the book but stops when Rohold presses his palm flat and says, "Look yourself. If this is a lie, cut my habit now." His voice carries. The sheriff takes the book, opens the page, and reads aloud a list of sales with dates and amounts. The crowd listens as numbers become evidence. The wheelwright calls for 2 nails and an iron band. Marcel hands them over. The wheelwright fits a spare band across the spoke where the crack runs and hammers it into place. Sparks fly in a shower that catches the torchlight and gilds dust motes. The narrator focuses on the mechanical, metal biting into wood, iron warping around a crack. The wheel will hold, but the first strike must be deliberate. Magistrate Kellen uses the delay to shift blame. He attempts to worm favor by naming me, Kellen says, voice tight. He throws names like a net to trap men who own property. The crowd answers with 2 camps speaking at once. A few faces in the front are pale with fear. Others are flushed with anger. The narrator notes lines of dialogue as instruments. Short, precise, and revealing. Sheriff Halving calls for silence and then asks the bailiff to repeat the sentence. The formal words fall like an instrument tuning before the performance. When the wheelwright raises the hammer for the first official blow, the climax arrives. The narrator records the physical violence. The hammer descends, metal meets bone, a sound like dry wood snapping and a hollow animal cry leaves Anselm. The first break is described clinically. The radius splintered, the arm folded at a wrong angle, the rope cutting into the skin. Anselm screams, one long paroxysm that then narrows into controlled gasps. He names a surname in the gap between breaths. The crowd reacts with a wave of noise that almost lifts embers from the torches. During the blows, the magistrate leans forward to hear the names more clearly. Kellen. Say his name, a spectator cries. Magistrate Kellen answers with a cold line. You will not save yourself by trading others my name without proof. The narrator keeps the dialogue tight. Short turns, fast exchanges. The wheelwright counts the strikes and sets the rhythm. Marcel holds Anselm's lower leg steady. Brother Rohold writes with a stub of charcoal, turning pages as if he were a clerk marking progress. Anselm's voice breaks between hits. Rohold knows where the receipts were kept, he says. Rohold took money for silence. He coughs and blood rises at the corner of his mouth. The sheriff tells the wheelwright to pause and listen. The wheelwright pauses, head tilted slightly, as if weighing the cost of delay against the order to proceed. His hands are steady. The pause becomes another test. Will the magistrate press or will the crowd accept evidence? The narrator marks the tension as a contest between law's performance and its accountability. After several strikes, the crowd fractures further. A woman near the front throws herself forward, shrieking, "You stop now! You stop this!" Guards shove her back. In the sudden press, a torch falls and rolls, guttering at the base of the scaffold. Sparks hiss on the wet wood. The crowd's mood flips. Some cry for mercy while others call for the wheelwright to finish the sentence. The narrator notes a new emotion shift. From coercion into panic among the watchers, a public unease that will alter alliances. When the breaking ends, the platform slides into a ragged hush. Anselm hangs from the spokes, blind with half-closed eyes, chest heaving. Brother Rohold steps forward and speaks in a voice that aims for record rather than appeal. He confessed certain names here in public. I wrote them as he spoke. The narrator notes that the confession has shifted from a single body's attempt at survival into a document that could alter market deals and magistrates' accounts. Magistrate Kellen's jaw works. He orders the guards to move the ledger to the town clerk. Seal it, he says, seal it, and let the court decide by law, not by mob rumor. The sheriff nods and motions. The narrator records the action directly. The ledger is handed to a clerk who steps away under escort. Marcel helps lower Anselm from the wheel onto a pallet. The wheelwright folds his hands and returns the hammer to his belt. The night has changed. The hill will hold the smell of iron and char for hours. Brother Rohold opens his mouth to speak again, but the narrator stops him and places the final beat. The chronicler's entry will reach the market, and the ledger will follow the clerk to the hall where auctions are certified. The chapter closes on a concrete event. The town clerk locks the ledger in a chest and hands the key to Magistrate Kellen's aide. The wheel's broken spoke sits propped against the scaffold. A single blackened smudge marks the wood where a splinter struck a torch. The narrator notes the aftermath without flourish. The confession has been recorded, the wheel has done its work, and the ledger now moves under seal. The immediate conflict of this chapter resolves into documented consequence, while the narrator promises that the ledger's movement will set the next chapter's revelations into motion. The hammer fell once and Anselm's arm jerked against the wood. Fear sat behind his ribs and pushed words out of him with each breath. Men tightened ropes at his ankles, and the wheelwright set his jaw against the next strike. The crowd pressed closer, torches cutting faces into hard planes. The problem was visible and immediate. Anselm would be broken to warn others that fear, raw, practical, and sharp, governed every choice he made on the hill. The narrator stepped back into the record as a clerk of events rather than a comforter. The man who spoke later in ledgers and margin notes had been watching since chapter 1, where hands had forced Anselm's wrists outward and iron bands had bitten splintered wood. Now, on the exposed hill, the same measurements of wood and iron repeated with a steadiness that pretended to be law. The narrator watched Anselm, watched the wheelwright, and catalogued motion as if anatomy could explain motive. He noted what the crowd did, and then wrote it down with the same clinical calm that had recorded the hammer striking the rim earlier. Anselm tried to shape his last words into something that would matter. He kept his eyes on the wheelwright's gauntleted hands. "Hugo," he said once, and then louder, because the name needed to reach the rows nearest the magistrate. "Hugo. They give you coin for silence." The wheelwright's hand did not stop. The assistant steadied a strap and wiped a smear of something dark against his palm. "Name them now." The wheelwright without, looking, voice low and gravelly. "I gave them names." Anselm rasped. "I gave 3 names to the bailiff. Myrick, he took bribes. Myrick and the captain. They signed the lists." His speech came in fragments. He spoke with the precision of someone listing injuries. Fear moved into bargaining. He traded secrets for breaths. The wheelwright's hammer lifted. The crowd answered with a ragged chant that named the crime. A magistrate stepped onto the raised rim of the platform, black cloak catching torchlight, and spoke to the assembly with the blunt language of duty. "Proceed," he said. "The sentence stands." His presence did not feel like justice. It felt like performance. The magistrate's decision made the execution theater. Anselm's voice dropped to a whisper that scraped against rope fibers. "Listen to me," he said to the people directly in front of him. "Listen to Myrick's ledger. It will show where money moved." He spat the words like stones. A woman in the second rank flinched and looked around, eyes hard. A boy held his torch with shaky hands and leaned forward as the name hit the air. The crowd fractured then, inches at a time. Some faces hardened into demand for more spectacle, the kind that swallowed names and left the powerful invisible. Others stepped back, hands covering mouths, seeing a man not as a criminal, but as a ledger with a voice. This was the first shift. Fear becoming something else, doubt in the crowd's certainty. The wheelwright paused before the next strike. His hammer hung in the air at the hub and his shoulders tightened. Anselm stared at that pause. He read it like a crack in wood. "Hugo," he breathed again. "You know me. I work the storehouse. You saw the papers. You know names." The wheelwright's jaw moved. For the first time, the craftsman allowed recognition to pass between them like a heat exchange. The assistant, a broad-shouldered man with a burn scar, grunted and pulled a strap tighter. "Do your duty," the wheelwright, but the words barely reached the rim of his mouth. His forearm showed the tremor of an old wound. "Do your duty," the assistant echoed with less conviction. The magistrate cleared his throat and stepped closer to the rim, a physical assertion more than an argument. "This is not for debate," he said. "You have witness and conviction. Continue." Anselm used the brief slack in the wheelwright's motion to force another name into the light. He forced the syllables out in short bursts. the way someone would list injuries to ensure each one was counted. "Captain Havel," he said. He signed the return. He took food from grain shipments and marked it as lost. A murmur rose. The magistrate's face did not change, but a clerk in the magistrate's shadow lifted his head and narrowed his eyes. A sudden shout broke from the back ranks, someone swearing the captain innocent, someone else swearing he had been seen with Myrick. The crowd cleaved into two currents. This was the second emotion shift. Bargaining and doubt shifted again into outrage and suspicion. Noise layered over noise. Men at the edges pushed forward, trying to glimpse the magistrate's clerk. The wheelwright's hammer fell with a practiced rhythm. When the first strike hit bone, the sound was not theatrical. It was compact and absolute. Anselm cried a single consonant and then counted out a name between teeth while the air took the sound away. The wheelwright worked deliberately, methodical strikes that split limb from limb in a measured sequence, not quick but not sentimental. The assistant set a block and held Anselm's leg while the wheelwright drove iron through expectation. "Stop!" Someone yelled from the front. A woman had pushed through a small ring of torches and planted herself near the platform. "He is speaking the truth." Her voice was sharp and practical. The wheelwright's hammer stilled again. The magistrate's hand moved, a signal to silence, but the signal did not land cleanly. A cluster of townsmen pressed closer to the magistrate and spoke in low, urgent sentences. "What ledger?" One demanded, "Where is this list?" Another voice answered with a direction. "The clerk at the town hall keeps receipts." "Ask him now." The clerk in the magistrate's shadow looked younger than his rank. His face carried the strain of copying names for hours. He swallowed and then stepped forward. The clerk's movement became an event the hill could not ignore. He crossed to the edge, handed a parchment to a townswoman who had identified herself as the bailiff's cousin, and mouthed the name Myrick. The bailiff's cousin read, and then let out a sound like a human incision. She held up the parchment for others to see. The magistrate's authority narrowed, and for the first time in the evening, the writ of the hill felt shaky. The wheelwright's hand trembled in a different way now. He had been morally insulated by routine until that sheet of paper shifted what his tool was doing. The craftsman's face tightened. He had always said he struck wood and iron, not politics. But wood and iron do not care who signs lists, and the wheelwright's hammer kept marking bodies anyway. Anselm took the short moments when the hammer rested to force more names into the air. He used pain like punctuation. Myrick took the shipment. He said, "Havel signed away grain." The magistrate's men saw the pay. Each name was a small detonator among the torches. The magistrate's hand moved faster now, and he mouthed a command to his clerk that made the clerk swallow and look down. A young man in the crowd pointed at the magistrate and shouted, "Why did you let it happen?" The magistrate answered with a slate reply about law and order. The young man shouted again, closer and louder, "You could have stopped it!" 3 voices answered him, some in defense and some in anger. The hill tilted for an instant from ritual to public reckoning. The wheelwright stepped back and took off one gauntlet, palms rubbing a burn scar as if to warm from the chill of recognition. His face dropped into a long, square mask of decision. He exchanged a look with the assistant, whose hand tightened on a strap. The assistant's name came out of the narrative ledger later as Otto. Here he pulled breath and shook his head twice, the small human movements that count as argument when words would be too public. Hugo, Anselm, forcing the craftsman's souled name into the air the way a surgeon names an organ. "You know the ledger. You counted sacks with me." The wheelwright's lips moved but did not form a protest. Instead, he made a professional calculation. How to finish the work and still keep the town's order. He was a man of duty facing a fracture. He had not been trained to measure. The magistrate's voice rose, thin with a need to regain control. "This is a sentence," he said. "It will be carried out." His tone tried to slice the hill into what must be done and what must not. Men around him echoed the line. duty, sentence, law. The crowd's earlier fracture hardened into a push and pull, edges clashing. Anselm forced the next syllable out between clenched teeth. Pain kept him precise. He pressed names into the air until the hill could not pretend the execution was only about his crime. A clerk in the magistrate's shadow stiffened and stepped back, then forward, then away, a loop of movement that marked where decisions lived. The wheelwright's hand lifted for the next strike. He hesitated visibly at the hub. Then he brought the hammer down. The strike answered itself with a geometry of sound. Iron on wood, flesh meeting constraint. Anselm hissed. He used the hiss to speak again. Havel sent men to take grain as tribute, he said. Havel and Myrick signed the same paper. A woman near the torches breathed through her teeth and began calling names in a list as if checking off debts. The crowd's noise sharpened into a call, and response where anger named the actors, and the actors were suddenly fewer and more exposed. Inside the sequence of strikes, voices traded short lines like punches. Anselm and the wheelwright had the most. Hugo, Anselm, look at me. Look at me and tell them you remember. The wheelwright's reply was a single, gravelly clause. I remember the storehouse, that small exchange carried memories that official records had buried. Someone in the fourth row, an older man who had stood through many markets, shouted, if the wheelwright remembers, then the ledger can be false. Two others answered, one with a curse, one with a call for the magistrate to produce proof. The hill became a courthouse and a market at once, each sound competing for authority. The sequence reached its terrible geometry. The wheelwright struck in patterns he had repeated so often he could have done it blind. Each blow bent law into spectacle. With every break, Anselm used breath to force a last truth. He demanded recitation, listing names like invoices. Myrick, Havel, the clerk who signed the receiving notes. Each name landed in a different face in the crowd and created another angle of risk for those who had thought themselves safe. In the middle of the breaking, the wheelwright faltered again. He gripped the hammer with both hands and his shoulders shook. The assistant muttered something that could have been a prayer or a bargain. Anselm slammed out a name that cut closer to the magistrate's household. The magistrate's jaw moved. The clerk in his shadow paled and tried to tuck the parchment deeper into his sleeve. The final sequence of strikes became a revelation rather than a punishment. Anselm's pain stitched together into accusation. He used the immediate, bodily fact of being broken to make the crowd listen. The sounds produced by the wheel and hammer were now the punctuation of evidence. People in the crowd began to trade names like currency. A rumor rose and spread toward the town like smoke. When the last blow landed and Anselm's torso slumped forward against the wheel, a new silence opened that was not awe, but recalibration. The magistrate moved to assert control, louder and more formal than before. Order! He barked, as though the word itself could reseal authority. Men at the edges obeyed, some because they had always obeyed and some because fear still lived in their muscles. A group near the front did not obey. They kept their hands clasped on the parchment the bailiff's cousin had shown earlier. The clerk in the magistrate's shadow looked down at his hands, and then up at the magistrate. He cleared his throat and spoke. There were receipts, he said. They are stamped. I can bring them to the hall. His voice was small, but the claim mattered. The magistrate's face flushed with controlled anger. The wheelwright and the narrator walked away from the platform together after the crowd thinned. The wheelwright's apron was streaked dark. His hands were hands that had missed softness years ago. The narrator catalogued the wheel's damage, splintered spokes, iron bands pried and bent, a spoke broken off near its hub, and did so with the same detached voice that recorded earlier strikes. But the wheelwright's admission came in a flat sentence that read like a confession of involvement rather than guilt. I did the work they asked, he said. I kept to measure. I do not know the rest. He did not ask for absolution. He did not seek to hide behind the tools. His voice carried the dry smoke scent of the yard. The narrator recorded the admission, duty as complicity. He listed the damage and procedure and the sequence of strikes with the same merciless precision he'd used in earlier chapters. He noted the wheelwright's burned scar, the gauntlet's worn leather, the way the craftsman paused before the last hammer fall. The wheelwright's words confirmed a system that turned cruelty into method. In the hours after, men dragged the wheel back to the stone yard. They lifted Anselm's body with a kind of exhausted efficiency and laid him by a cross at the slope's base. Dawn crept in, pale and deliberate. A single broken spoke remained embedded in the earth beside the cross. No one moved to pull it free at first. Someone set a remnant of candle wax near the spoke, and a feather drifted down from a bird that had been roosting on a fence post. The rumor moved into town with the morning markets. The bailiff's cousin took the clerk's parchment to the hall and demanded a hearing. Voices that had only watched now had names to attach to expectation. Men who had eaten grain that had been marked as lost said so aloud when they met each other on market day. The magistrate sent runners to the hall to collect the rolling papers and receipts. He issued a quiet order to silence some questions and to answer others with fabricated calm. The narrator closed his ledger with the same hand that had written the earlier chapters. He noted the last concrete facts. The wheel's broken spoke, the ledger at the town hall, the clerk's slip, the bailiff cousin's petition. He did not speak of fate or justice. He recorded what he could see and what the wheelwright admitted aloud. He listened for the way townspeople adjusted their steps when they met the magistrate in the market. In the final minutes, as dawn broke into a thin sepia light that washed the execution hill, someone from the crowd, an older man who had shouted earlier, picked up the broken spoke and drove it into the soft earth by the cross until only a splinter showed. He did not speak. The action was small and unmistakable. Evidence embedded, as if the land itself could hold testimony. The narrator described that small, deliberate burial and then closed the scene with concrete results. The magistrate called a meeting at the hall. The clerk was summoned to produce receipts. The bailiff's cousin filed charges. The wheelwright returned to his workshop and replaced his gauntlets with hands that knew the weight of a hammer and of a choice. Otto the assistant went to tend the smith's fire and refused to meet the magistrate's eye when he passed. No sweeping closure arrived that morning. The hill had given up a man, a set of receipts, and a spoke embedded in earth. Rumor became procedure. Procedure would demand naming and then judgment. The narrator left the final inventory on the table. A body taken under sentence, a craftsman who admitted remembering, a clerk who could produce stamped receipts, and a single broken spoke that two different people would later point to as proof of what had happened on that hill. Anselm's body did not become a warning in the pure way the magistrate had intended. For some, it became evidence. For others, it became an accusation. The wheelwright kept to his method but did not find solace in it. The magistrate preserved order for the moment with commands, but rumors and receipts would press at the edges of his control. That was the chapter's last movement. A narrow, concrete shift in who could be called to account. The broken spoke stuck in the ground like a statement the town could not ignore. People came to touch the wood with fingers they used for weighing grain and counting coins. A child traced the fissure with a timid hand. A woman read the clerk's script and folded the page into her apron. A man who had marched in the magistrate's guard did not sleep that night. The narrator folded his notes and placed them beside a brass pocket watch that had clicked through the night. He had seen the sequences before. The measure, the strike, the witness. He had not expected the moment when a craftsman's glance could sway a ceremony or when a single parchment could split a crowd. He recorded those specifics without rhetoric. At dawn, when a thin light left the torches like ghosts of flame, someone knocked at the magistrate's door in the hall. The knock was deliberate and it carried consequence. The magistrate rose from his table and put on his cloak. The narrator watched him go and wrote the last line. The magistrate answered the knock. That action closed the chapter on a concrete beat, a change of scene that promised the next procedural steps would be public, contested, and measured by receipts and witnesses rather than by speeches. The hill remained marked. The wheel pieces piled in the yard would be inventoried and stored. The wheelwright's tools would be kept close. Otto would carry coals for weeks and think of the faces in the crowd. Anselm's names would move into halls and into the mouths of merchants. The narrator sealed his ledger for the moment and left a list of the facts he could prove with ink and witness. He left the single image that could not be reduced to ledger entry. A broken spoke fixed in the earth beneath the cross and the faint smear of candle wax at its base. The chapter ends on that concrete action. A knock at the magistrate's door, a decision to be answered. There is no sermon, no moralizing. There is only the record of what was done, who did it, and what the town would now have to reckon with. The broken wheel had completed its work on a single body, but in doing so it exposed more bodies of interest: the ledger, the clerk, the bailiff, the magistrate's choices. The narrator closed his book and watched the magistrate open the door, a measured movement that carried the next event into daylight.